Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Francys Johnson, and we're going to get right into it. I want Dr. Johnson to introduce himself to the people, let them know where you went to school, let them know about your career path, and we'll just start off with the first question. Why are you running for Congress?
Absolutely. It's good to be with you and to share with your listeners and your audience some truth about what's going on in the midterm elections, particularly down here in Georgia's 12th congressional district, which is made up of the cities of Augusta. That's the hometown of James Brown, the godfather of soul, the hardest working man in show business. We need a congressman who will work as hard as James Brown for this district. It includes other places like Dublin, Statesboro, Douglas. This is the heart of Southeast rural Georgia. And this is the congressional seat that we're seeking to reclaim on behalf of the 714,940 neighbors that we have here in this district who need a voice in the People's House, the House of Representatives. I'm Francys Johnson. I'm a lawyer and have practiced law for a number of years, particularly in constitutional torts, and civil and criminal law. I've done so in the state and federal courts here in Georgia. I am also a pastor. I have pastored two of God's best churches. One, the Mount Moriah Baptist Church, which was started by ex-slaves nearly 158 years ago, and the Sweet Magnolia Baptist Church, which is celebrating its 104th anniversary on next Sunday. In addition to that, I've also been privileged to teach constitutional law, race and the law, jurisprudence, criminal law at both Georgia Southern University and Savannah State University. And so I'm just real privileged to be here, to have the opportunity at this point in my life to serve. And I know that our people need a voice in Congress. Congress is a pretty important part of our government as a co-equal branch of government. Its job is not to kowtow to the president. Its job is to balance power across government, produce effective laws, establish effective policies that make government work for people. Remember, this is a democracy, and our government has been dedicated to the proposition that it should be by, for, and accountable to the people. And right now, that's not the Congress that we have.
Okay, so, I mean, you understand that there are other people running and everything like that. So, like, what really prompted you? Like, what made you say, well, I'm an attorney, I'm a pastor, so let me go into Congress, let me run for that office. Like, what made you cross the threshold from thinking about running to actually doing it and making it manifest?
Well, I will tell you, the idea first came into my mind about service as an extension of the love for my people. I don't think that real leadership begins when one says, I'm going to lead. I think real leadership begins when one says, I love my people enough to sacrifice for them. And make no mistake about it, to run for office, to do anything in the search of the common good is a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice for teachers who have to get up tomorrow and go to a job that doesn't pay them what they deserve. They have to spend money out of their own pockets for school supplies, and they have to work against a system that says to them success is teaching towards a test rather than trying to expand the critical thinking skills of a group of people for whom critical thinking skills are not necessary to tote that barge and lift that bell. So this is a sacrifice, but it's no greater sacrifice than many people make across a number of pursuits. But it's necessary if we're going to move our people forward. Barack Obama, when he was giving his last State of the Union address, quoted a Black Baptist preacher from Georgia, Martin King, who in 1964 was accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. And as dark as that moment was, this is a pretty dark moment that we're in right now. But as dark as this moment is now, it was not nearly as dark as the moment our people found themselves in 1964, where we had bodies hanging from trees, our loved ones being thrown in rivers, civil rights workers being removed from earthen dams, crosses burning on our yards, and as I stated before, strange fruit hanging on our trees. Those were dark days. And in the midst of that darkness, King said that he still believed that truth crushed to the earth would rise again. That at the end of the day, that goodwill would have the final say. It would reign triumphant among men. And it's amazing that he was able to have that light in the midst of darkness. And it was amazing that Barack Obama chose to quote and conclude his last State of the Union address by quoting that Black Baptist preacher. I think what Barack was trying to say to us, if we had ears to hear, and what history should have said to us, that after every expansion of freedom and opportunity in this country, there is a backlash, that there is a ferocious backlash. I think we knew that it was coming. I think Barack Obama knew that it was coming, but he wanted us to be reminded in that moment that when it comes, it will be up to us to determine whether we will take a backward step or not, and how long that backlash and how much ground it will take in terms of its retrogression. I'm convinced that this backlash will fail because people are uniting all across this country. Groups are forming that never existed before. Coalition groups of citizens of all colors and faiths and no faith in particular, but who are deeply committed to a new moral framework. When I look at what my friend and former colleague in the NAACP, William Barber, is doing with the Poor People's Campaign, and we're big supporters and actually a part of that movement here in Georgia. When I look at in the invisible groups that are starting all over this country, when I look at moms, mocha moms, and Black Lives Matter groups, and others who are lifting their voice and toting their portion of the load in terms of lifting the resistance to this, I'm encouraged. And so I began to think about how I might contribute to this effort, how best I could show love for my people through sacrifice in service, and it became apparent to me that if we are going to, in the workings of our democracy, stand up against this president, then we have to reclaim the House of Representatives. That's where all bills for appropriations began. It's also where all bills for impeachment began. And the House of Representatives is the people's house. It should be a check on the presidency. And right now we don't have that in the congressman that represents this district. And so President Barack Obama on his last day in office said, if you don't like what you see, get a clipboard, talk to your neighbors, and run for something. And I have done a lot of organizing over my lifetime. Never thought I'd ever be a candidate, but I'm offering my experience, the record of fighting for progressive values over the last 20 years, and the respect I have for my neighbors who know they can count on me to fight for what is right.
So what distinguishes you from all the other candidates that are running for office, like all the other Democratic candidates and against the incumbent? You talked about some of the distinctions between the incumbent, but let's talk about the other people that you're running against in the Democratic Party.
Sure. There are two primary opponents in the Democratic primary. One is a roofer. He owns a roofing company and manages a small nonprofit. The other is a CPA, and both are good men. I think both of them would be better representatives of our neighbors than the sitting Republican congressman, Rick W. Allen, who is not smart enough, not sensible enough, and not strong enough to represent this district. And I think it's up to the people. This is a democracy, that root word demos, which means people. This is the people's house. This is their representative in the Congress. And I think the question that voters are asking themselves is, first of all, before you can serve in Congress, you have to win the election. Who is best positioned to take on a sitting member of Congress, an incumbent, against all the powers that are inherent in incumbency, against all that there is in terms of the machinery to overcome, in terms of unseating an incumbent? Who is best positioned to do that? And I think when you consider the fact that neither of the other two gentlemen have worked in policy, have had to organize, have had to work with people they didn't agree with, but yet find common ground, then I think that from those aspects, a record does matter. And I've fought for voting rights over the years, been involved in every major issue regarding voting rights, at least over the last 10 years in Georgia. And I'm very proud of that record, particularly our record on equality before the law for all people, especially those who are discriminated based on their race or their gender or their sexual orientation or their religion. Very proud of our record, strong record on that. Very proud of our record on criminal justice reform, where in Georgia, we work with Republican administrations to ban the box in state employment, to reform our penal system and our justice system in terms of both juvenile justice, adult sentencing, and community supervision, reducing the length of prison sentences. We did all of that while working with a Republican administration, because when you go to represent people, you don't go to represent just the Democrats. You go to represent all people, but you should have a basis of values by which you lead from. And that my value is rooted in this sort of axiom that I developed during my time with the NAACP, which is that we have no permanent friends or enemies. We just have a permanent issue, and that is the liberation of our people. So I'm not going to Congress to be beholden to the Democratic Party, to Nancy Pelosi. I'm not going to Congress to be beholden to the president, Democrat or Republican. I work for the people of this district. That's who will send me to Congress. That's who I'll be accountable to every day. So I think a record distinguishes me from my opponents. I think a set of clear values that we've advanced against policy gains matter. I think the Congress is not a place that you need to take training wheels to.
I hear you. So you touched on voting rights, and I want to talk about that briefly, because there are a lot of people who are disenfranchised, or people who don't see the value of voting. There are a lot of people that say, well, a lot of these politicians are bought and paid for. They're not going to create any kind of real change. So can you talk about like why voting is important and why a politician like you will actually make a difference for your district?
So I think that we have to acknowledge that there's some truth to the complaint that we hear that that really there's no real choice on the ballot. That we elect Democrats and they get there and they don't have a backbone, won't stand up for what they believe in. You elect Republicans, at least they tell you what they think about you, which is not much. And so people check out when they don't see a return on their vote. I have to acknowledge that. And I won't try to ignore that fact. The fact of the matter is that's why candidates matter. And we fight so hard to make sure that the ballot box is unfettered, that people can cast a ballot, and that the election system is not so rigged, not so gerrymandered, not so fixed that communities cannot come together and elect real candidates of their choices that will go forward on an agenda that they approve. And so I will tell folks that, yes, there are many problems in our democracy, but our democracy is not a spectator sport. You have to get up, get out, and do something if you want to make lasting change. And in this country, you don't have to be willing to lead a bloody revolution to do it. If you don't like the tax reform, the so-called tax reform, where this government just gave $1.5 trillion to millionaires and billionaires, while at the same time seeking to increase the rent in HUD housing, that's affordable housing, while at the same time seeking to eliminate food stamps for women and children who need them desperately in order to not go hungry in the richest country on the face of this planet. If you don't like the foreign policy direction of this country, then every 2 years you can lead your own revolution by casting your vote. It is the one thing in this country which we all have a sense of equality. Warren Buffett may be richer than I am, but when we go into that voting booth, he has one ballot the same way I have one ballot. Unfortunately, part of the programming of those in power is to convince people who are not in power to give up what little power they have and to turn over the vote by not showing up. And so I would urge folks to not fall for the okie doke, but to realize that it's to people's best interest that you not cast a ballot. If voting was not important, then why do so many people who don't look like us, who don't have our community's interests, why do so many of them cast their ballots? Because it does matter. And democracy is the root of our politics, the basis of our politics. And Anderson, politics is not complicated. It's just who gets what, when, where, and if you get it at all. And if you want to get more than you got now, then you better exercise the right to vote.
Yeah, I hear you. You know, and I'll just add that, like, if our vote didn't matter, they wouldn't go out of their way to suppress our vote. You know, there wouldn't have been Jim Crow, there wouldn't have been poll taxes and literacy tests, there wouldn't have been the KKK trying to prevent us from voting, there wouldn't have been the Shelby County versus Holder case if our vote didn't matter. But I wanted to touch on one thing about this.
Not just those cases from history or Shelby County, which was in 2013, but right now, people are conniving and plotting and scheming to undermine this election. They're doing so in Georgia by purging people from the rolls. We sued Brian Kemp over and over again to let him understand, and he failed to comprehend. But we sued him until he comes to the realization, we will sue him until he comes to the realization that it is not his to remove people from the rolls contrary to the law, or to adjust the registration date outside of the time affixed by statute, or to not put people on the rolls who registered. And Brian Kemp simply has failed. That's our Secretary of State here in Georgia. But he is just the head on a organization which has always worked to undermine people's franchise. From the moment the 15th Amendment was passed and ratified by this country, there's been an attempt to undermine that through, first of all, convincing folks that their vote doesn't matter by using intimidation and fear to get people to give up their vote, and to use every other mechanism in government to take the vote away, including the rise of the massive prison industrial complex, which if you get a felony, your right to vote can be limited. And so that's why we see the expansion of felonies in this country and the criminal justice system. In every single way possible, those who have opposed an expansion of the we and we the people have tried to undermine the right to vote, because the right to vote is your voice in this democracy. It is what matters to you in terms of the search for the common good. And there's some folks who simply don't believe that we should include as many people as possible. I beg to differ. And if we're going to make this country what it ought to be, then it will mean that we all have to lift our voice about what matters to us.
Yeah, so the next question I have is deals with the Democratic Party. You know, often you hear people say that the Democratic Party takes the black vote for granted. They take the black vote for granted. And then also when you look at cities like Baltimore, like Detroit, and other urban areas that are run by Democrats, people will look at the condition of those cities and say, well, the Democrats have failed the black community. These democratic programs have not done anything to improve the black community, like in these urban areas. So what is your response to people that bring that point to bear?
My point is that there's some truth to that. There is a lot of truth to that. We believe that if we change the players, that somehow we would get a different outcome. And I think representation does matter. It does matter. In a city like Baltimore or in a city like Augusta here in Georgia that is majority African American, I think it does matter that the leadership look like the people whom they represent. But just changing the players is not enough to get a different outcome. If you want a different outcome, you've got to change the game itself. Because if you just change the players and don't change the game, you're going to get the same outcomes, except I think you get the kind of dismay that is at the heart of your question. How can every major city in Georgia be led by African American, Democratic leaning politicians, and we still not see decrease in African American unemployment? We still don't see a rise in affordable housing and mixed income developments in communities. We still don't see an explosion of small businesses in the African American community that are properly resourced and financed. We still don't see the kind of cohesion that we'd love to see, the kind of reforms of criminal justice that we'd love to see. And I would argue that politics is more than, and getting more out of politics is more than just about electing a politician. Oftentimes in these cities, whereas the Democrats and those African Americans who may have been elected control the policy, that policy is largely set by those who still hold the pocketbooks. And we should never, ever, ever misstate the fact that those who hold the pocketbooks hold a great deal of power of what happens in our community. And so I would urge that we have to begin to draft candidates who run on change agendas and a platform of change. I am not running to Congress so that I can remain in Congress. I'm running for Congress to be able to make effective change on behalf of my people. If that means that I'm a one-term congressman, I'm okay with that. And I think, you know, once you get there and your desire is to stay there, then it becomes more difficult for you to make the change that you seek. Make no mistake about it, we all will have some influence in our life, whether it's the influence that a parent has over a child. Soon that influence will begin to dissipate as that child becomes older, and you won't have that same influence. You should exercise the influence while you have it. When if you're in a management job, you have some authority, you won't have that authority forever. There will be another manager who will take your job after you're gone. While you have that authority in your hands, do what is right with it. And likewise, when you hold an elected position or an appointed position, whether it's in government or in the private sector, you won't have that power always. Do what you can with it while you have it, so that when you look back, you won't have to look back with regrets. So that future generations will look back and say, there was a real servant who did what they could with what they had, where they were, and it made the difference in my life. It made the difference in others' lives. And so I think we can't deny the truth that's at the heart of your question. But I think we also have to remember that we have to put up better candidates. We have to support them once they're in office, and we have to hold them accountable. And if they're not doing what we need them to do, we need to vote their asses out of office and put somebody in office who will actually get the job done.
So you know about the issue of police brutality. You know, that's an issue that's in the news all the time. We heard about Stephon Clark. We
Yeah.
saw this case of a woman in a Waffle House who was thrown to the ground and treated in a disrespectful manner. We saw the case of an older woman in her 70s yanked out of her car and yelled at and, you know, verbally abused by police officers. Every day we see another case of police brutality. If you are elected to Congress, what will you do to fight against police brutality, police misconduct, and racial profiling?
Well, the first thing that I would do is that I would sign on as a supporter for federal policy that the NAACP has supported called the End Racial Profiling Act. I think it has some good tools in it that will first let us get our hands around the problem and force departments to begin collecting that data, because it's not uniformly collected now and reported. That will give greater resources to communities to support community-based policing, where police officers are drawn from the communities they serve. I think that's always to the advantage of the people to be served, that the police officers live in their communities and that they're serving their neighbors as opposed to being an occupying force. Mm-hmm. I think we also have to get at the heart of dealing with implicit bias. But we also have to get at the heart of policing itself. Make no mistake about it. The rise of the police force in this country coincides with the end of slavery, coincides with the rise of the prison industrial complex. It coincides with the rise of the felony state. The police are there at the spear's tip to enforce the policies of this country. And the policies of this country have largely been a policy against people of color, against poor people in general, period. And that's the stated intent of our policies. And so we should not be surprised when communities that have been targeted are the ones who feel the brunt of the police. Their root word to police is the word pala, which means to rule. Same root that's in the root word of policy, which is the rule, which is in the same root word of the word politics, which is the system of rule. And so the police are just there as the front lines to enforce our policies. Bad policies that police have to enforce on a daily basis ends up killing too many people of color, poor people in general, too many Americans in general. America has a problem with its police, and we've got to deal with that, and Congress ought to work to deal with that. Now, I want to be careful because I didn't say that police are a problem, because I think police have to enforce the policies that are passed by their legislatures, their city councils, their county commissions, and by the Congress. And if we had a policy that stated that corporations couldn't gouge their consumers because they can, like we're gouged every day by electric companies and our utilities, then the police would then enforce the law against those corporations. If we had laws that said that in the richest land in the land on the planet, that it would be against the law for children to go hungry while corporations throw away food. The U.S. government pays farmers to dispose of milk rather than giving it to hungry children and the like. Then the police will be enforcing those laws towards the better interest of our people. So if you hate police, I think you should step back and examine it. What you hate is the policies they're enforcing. And if you hate that, you ought to change the people who make the policies.
So someone in the chat room asked about reparations. What's your position on reparations for slavery?
Well, my good friend Malawi Davis, I've got to mention him. He's a lawyer in Atlanta, and me and Malawi have been working on reparations and the issues of reparations and thinking about it. And for as long as we wanted to be lawyers. 20 years ago, we were discussing this and trying to see how we could, as young lawyers, advance this just as Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley and Jack Greenberg and others advanced a new set of a new strategy in the law to undermine segregation. And so I think this is a good work that we must put our brightest minds towards. And we've got to pick this back up again. Reparations is not hard to understand. I practice civil law, and there are times when I have represented people who've been injured because of the negligence of other people or the willful actions of other people. And all reparations is remediation for the damage that's done. And no one can honestly look at 398 years of oppression in this country, on this land, and not see the damage that's been done. And the record shows that other communities that have been damaged have received reparations. And so it's not as if we can't see the damage. It's not as if we don't have a record of providing some remediation to people who have experienced this. It's a matter of the will of this country to do the right thing. And make no mistake about it, Frederick Douglass speaks to me in this moment and reminds me that power will concede nothing without a demand. And so what is our demand in this moment? I asked that question for 8 years of a Democratic president being in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I asked that question to the members of the Congressional Black Caucus. I asked that question to the members of who lead our social and civic organizations, the Divine Nine, the civil rights organizations. What is our demand in this moment? People are not going to just voluntarily agree to do anything. And they're certainly not going to voluntarily agree to pay what they owe. And so this is something that you have to demand. You have to organize ourselves to demand it. When I consider Kaepernick and the NFL boycott, we couldn't even organize effectively to demand that one man get a job that he deserved. I know that the hill and the mountain towards this movement is high and steep. I know that there's different viewpoints on it. I still believe that it's right to consider these things. And I would, of course, support legislation in the Congress to study the issue and move us towards meaningful reparations for not just people of color, African Americans who have a legacy of slavery, but for the indigenous people of this country who have been nearly exterminated and put to extinction by the policies of the United States government.
My next question is about the problem of mass incarceration. You touched on it. What kind of proposals do you have to address the problem of mass incarceration? And also, I want to know what kind of proposals do you have to address the inequality in the school system in terms of the lack of resources in Black communities, the lack of, equally competitive schools compared to affluent white suburbs. What kind of proposals do you have to address those two issues?
Sure. So I think the first part of your question dealt with mass incarceration. I think one of the things we can do is we can continue to educate the public about the problem itself. The fact that there are people who make lots of money with things remaining as they are. And so for my community, the status quo is simply untenable. It's unacceptable. It is not something which is sustainable moving forward. And so we've got to address it. In Georgia, we've addressed it in a couple of ways. One, we've reformed our sentencing, which means that we try to have a greater respect for proportionality in sentencing, that the sentence should fit the crime, and when you don't have sentences that fit the crime, then it undermines the public's confidence in the law. We've also developed re-entry programs that help our returning citizens, and I call them returning citizens, not ex-cons, because they are victims, many of them are victims of the so-called war on crime, war on drugs, war on everything, which has really been a war on people of color and poor people. And so these returning citizens need a whole lot of resources, and we could make greater resources available for job training, for education, for resettlement, for housing, for those things. And it benefits all of us when we can help individuals to stand up on their own 2 feet and to be able to move forward as productive citizens. And so both from the criminal law standpoint, from the criminal justice standpoint, but also from the human standpoint, we have to realize that casualties of this war on drugs, war on crime, our draconian laws in both of those areas means that a lot of communities are crippled, and we've got to do all we can to stand up these communities. And so that's what I would do. I would be an approach to continue to encourage reform at the state level and local level, and certainly reform across the federal system on the criminal law side, which is at the heart of the system, but also on the human aspects of the mass prison industrial complex and all of the human issues that it has a cause and effect relationship towards. I think your second question dealt with education. Make no mistake about it, the surest rung on the ladder of economic mobility in this country is a good education. And there's an undermining of the entire rung of economic mobility in this country. And that is particularly in focus when you look at the rung on that ladder that deals with education. Right now we have in 12th district, I'm running against a congressman who supports everything that Betsy DeVos says. Betsy DeVos doesn't even believe in public education. We deeply believe in public education because we know that the vast majority of our children, of America's children, will be educated in the public school systems. And we need a school system that will prepare them for the world, the global opportunities that the world has to offer to them. And right now, we cannot say that they're getting that world-class education. And so we've got to reimagine what education looks like. 4-year-olds are showing up in kindergarten already with a deficit in terms of being able to have the requisite skills to learn than their white peers that show up at 4 years old. I think we have to develop community learning centers where a mother can take their child and get the kind of nourishment that they need academically and otherwise from that critical standpoint, 6 months to 3.5, 4 years old. I think we could afford in this country to make universal pre-K a matter of our public education system. And then I think we've got to look at what we're actually doing in K through 12. I deeply believe that everyone who desires to go to college should have access to college, and that college should be debt-free. There should be some options for college to be debt-free. But I don't think college has to be the end-all and be-all for everybody. I think there's a great need for high-skilled craftsmen, tradesmen, and folks who will go into highly technical skills that and fields that don't require a college degree. And so I think we've got to get back to really looking at that. I think we can do that in ways that don't put people on pathways because of discriminatory reasons, which was a concern when I was coming along, that lots of people were being pushed away from college preparatory because they were African American or they were poor or they were women. And so I think that we can do this. We've got to reimagine what public education looks like. And I would go to work doing that. But you've got to believe in public education. And I know that folks say, well, the market can take care of that. There were private universities in this country before they were public universities. I attended the University of Georgia School of Law. It was a pretty good public law school, ranked number 20 when I went there a long time ago. It's a better law school today, thanks to the faculty and staff and the great students. And I serve as a member of the Alumni Association there. It's a great school, but it was chartered as the first public university in 1785. It was chartered because the citizens believed that they wanted to educate their own populace and do that through the mechanisms of government. Government is just people doing together what they cannot do as well by themselves. And so they chartered this university, University of Georgia, go Dogs. And it is a great economic engine in our state today because of the people's investment in public education. That's not to say that the private universities that function don't have a role, but the vast majority of people in this country need access to good public goods, and the public education is a public good. And so I think we have to look at education again, reimagine what it must be in the 21st century to serve this present age. In Georgia, our education system is largely based on an agrarian calendar where we send our children on summer vacation for 2 months and they forget 40% of the stuff they learned in the school year. How is that effective to serve the needs of our community today? And so I think we've got to look at what works, what's working around the world, and what will work in our communities. We still fund our school systems largely based on where a child's parents live. And where we live in this country is still largely governed by the same sort of racial attitudes, segregated communities that have existed throughout for the last 100 years. And so if we continue to fund schools based on zip code, rather than the value that every child deserves an equitable education, I think we're going to continue to get what we've gotten, which is sort of mixed results. And so we can do this. We must do this. Our children will have difficult questions about why we didn't do this if we don't, when the answers are right here before us, and we could help to make a better education system for them. I appreciate both questions.
All right, thanks for your response. And the next question deals with social issues. What is your position on the right to choose, or abortion rights, and how do you reconcile that position with your job as a pastor of a church and the whole issue of life and death?
Yeah. I've pastored again for 19 years, and in all that we do as pastors, the ups and downs of dealing with people in their most vulnerable positions in life, when they're burying their loved ones, but also the most joyous times in their life when they're bringing new life into the world. This is a very, very serious subject for me from a moral and religious standpoint. And it's a personal one too. People ask me how many children my wife and I have, and I always state we have 3 children, and we do. They're good. Joshua Johnson and Langston Hughes Eliza Johnson, but we also had a middle child who is no longer with us. He's our angel now, Frederick Douglass Caleb Johnson. My wife and I had to make serious decisions as it relates to Frederick's life. We had an amnio done, and it was determined that he would probably be born with some severe birth defects and some developmental challenges, including being born with Down syndrome and heart disease and lung disease and several other things. Of course, we chose life as it relates to our choice. We did that after praying to our God and after talking with our doctors. I think we have a limited government. I don't think government should be as big as to barge into that doctor's office or into our pastor's study and to tell us what to do at the point of a gun in that moment. I am grateful that we chose life. I'm grateful that we were blessed with the gift of Frederick for the 6 months that he lived. I also tell you there's been no decision that's been more gut-wrenching in all of my life than to make that decision. But I do think that that is a woman's decision, and I will defend my neighbor's right to choose. You cannot believe in a limited government that's so limited it cannot defend our voting rights, a limited government that it cannot defend the basic protections of people when it comes to discrimination, when it comes to the abuse at the hands of police, a government that's so limited that it cannot ensure a living wage for the people, a government that's so limited that it can't do anything to regulate the production of killing machines that are sold in its streams of commerce, that a government that is so limited that it cannot do anything, but a government that is so big that it can barge into the bedrooms of every American. You cannot have it both ways. I think we have a fairly workable solution that 88% of the American public believes in, that abortions should be as few as possible, but the ones that that women choose to have should be accessible and safe. And let me just say this. I think for a long time, men have had far too much to say about what a woman does with her body. And I know that there are lots of folks out there who will disagree with me on this, but I am firmly convinced that there are certain things, as my faith teaches me, that are the responsibility of men, and certain things that are responsibility of women. And what an awesome responsibility it is to bring life into this world, and what an awesome and terrible choice that it is when it is not the right choice for a person to bring life into this world. When folks begin to talk about these issues, they often try to demagogue the issue. I know in all of my time in practice as a pastor that no one has come to me and said that it was an easy choice, but neither is bringing a rapist child into this world, or neither is bringing a child into this world that is going to have severe and profound challenges for the rest of their life, or whatever quality of life that might be. These are very tough choices. I want Congress to get the simple stuff right. Can Congress pass a living wage? Can Congress pass some reforms to affordable health care to make it more accessible? Can Congress strengthen our public education system? Can Congress make sure that we invest in our infrastructure so good, high quality jobs can be located in our communities? Can Congress get out of the way in terms of people so that people can do what they need to do to flourish? Those are things that Congress should be concerned about. It's the easy stuff that Congress should be concerned about. And they're not doing very well in that regard. That's a very tough question. And I hope that I've answered it. I've tried to answer it from the best way I can, which is from the heart.
Yeah, so the next question deals with immigration reform. I mean, you know about what's happening in terms of the Dreamers and, this Trump administration really clamping down on immigrants. They're talking about building that wall and strictly enforcing immigration laws. What is your position on immigration? And how do you think this immigration issue impacts the Black community? You will have many say that African Americans are losing jobs and resources to illegal immigrants. What's your response?
Bullshit. That's my response. I mean, it's just simply not the case.
Well, break it down. Like, explain exactly why it's not the case. You know.
Okay, I'll do the best as I can. You know, it just strains credulity. It really does. That people believe that building a wall on the southern border of this country has anything to do with our security. The people who attacked this country on 9/11, most of those who infiltrated our borders came in through Canada. Nobody's trying to build a wall across the northern border. This is simply an attempt of those who've now been vested with the privilege of calling themselves Americans to be able to deny that to someone else. And it goes against the most fundamental aspect of decency, that I cannot reserve for myself, Anson, something that I would deny to other people, that I cannot claim something for myself that I would not permit others to have. And the prosperity that is ours in this country, the bountiful blessings that are ours, are what people come to this country looking for. And it has been that great diversity of people coming from all over the world that has made this country what it is. I am grateful that the indigenous people didn't have a policy likened unto the Trump policy when the first ships arrived here from Europe. Maybe if they did, it would have been better for them. Likewise, maybe it would have been better for the African people if they had that same policy too, when the Europeans showed up. What I do know is this, that the ethos of this country is out of many, we are one. E pluribus unum. And that is not reflected in our current policy on immigration. It's inhumane, it's not decent, and it's un-American. That's what I say about that. From an economic standpoint, in terms of African Americans losing our interest, let me say this: we've been here 398 years. And if our argument is that people who just crossed the Rio Grande are taking opportunities from us, if that's an argument that people actually want us to believe with a straight face, and I'd say, get the hell out of here, because it's just simply not true. When you go back and look through history, this is all, and you asked me to break it down, so I'm gonna break it down. There is a imaginary and illusory identity called whiteness, and it is elastic, buddy. It is expansive, and it's going to expand again pretty soon. If you don't watch this, we'll all be amazed when it happens. But remember, I told you tonight, people come to this country as immigrants, and they eventually all make it into whiteness. But I remember what those signs used to say. Those signs used to say, no Jewish, no dogs, no blacks. They used to say, no Polish, no dogs, no blacks. No Italians, no dogs, no blacks. I can go down the list of people who could have never considered themselves white, because white originally meant Anglo-Saxon, who now consider themselves white. Like I said, we've been here for 398 years, and we'll never be considered white, which means privileged, which means to be able to say to others, you can't have. When, you know, you just look back in history, somebody told you you couldn't have it. And so you get the strange juxtaposition of a John Kelly as chief of staff in the executive branch, the White House, whose Irish forefathers would have not been able to pass muster on the very policy he's lifting up right now. Donald Trump, whose family had to change their name, the spelling of their name, to adjust their identity in this country, whose wife, the first lady of the United States, violated the very policy that he subscribes to and is lifting up, whose family is now becoming citizens because of their relationship to her, what he calls chain migration, which I refuse to call, because my people were brought here in chains. but the policy that his very family, his wife, his in-laws couldn't even come to this country. It's bombastic hypocrisy. It's bullshit, like I said before. And for African Americans to look down their nose at our brown brothers and sisters who are looking for nothing but a better way of life for themselves and their children, and to let folks put the excuse on the system, on this government's failure, on those who conspire to keep communities of color down by pitting them against each other for crumbs while they eat the meat, drink the wine and the bread. No, I won't fall for that okie doke, and I would advise anyone listening to this to just look at what's happening, and they would see through that as a smokescreen, a red herring, and scapegoating at the very least.
So the last couple of questions are going to deal with foreign policy. So what is your position on Donald Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal? And what do you think about the decision to bomb Syria?
So let me say this. I want to just go back for a moment to what you said. Yeah, I just think if we're all adjusting to the norm, and we've got to remember this is a part of the programming, which suggests that by 2050, I think that's right, that this country will be a majority minority country. Have you heard that before, Anson?
Yeah, I've heard about that. Yeah, there's
by 2050, this will be a majority minority country. But if the people who considered themselves white in 1968, April 4th, 1968, the day that Martin King was shot and killed in Memphis, were the people who could consider themselves white today, white people who've already been a minority a long time ago. Like I said, there's an elasticity to whiteness that continues to expand for some, not for all, that vests you with some privileges. And a part of being vested with those privileges is that you got to be willing to deny access to other people in exchange for that. And there are folks who will do that. But I think it betrays your history as a Jewish American. And I'm so proud of the work we've done with the Anti-Defamation League to not remember that once you were. I think it betrays history for Italian Americans to not remember that once you were. For Polish Americans to say, once you were. For all of us to say, once we were. And some of us still we are. As we think about our immigration policy. And then from the standpoint of, and that's just one aspect of immigration. The average application for legal immigration in this country takes around 20 years. That's too long. That's too long, too complicated. And when you produce a system that is that unsensible, and that convoluted and that costly, then what you have is the sort of issues that we're dealing with right now, where people are finding ways around those systems. Excuse me. And so I think you wanted to move on to foreign policy, and I'm glad to talk about that in terms of Donald Trump's pulling back from the Iranian nuclear deal. I think that we must face the fact that we have a man in the White House who is simply just simply not up to the task of managing the complicated affairs that are global politics in this moment. But make no mistake about it, there is a strategy to what he is attempting to do in terms of the play, in terms of going against the Iranian deal. I'm opposed to that action. I think it's a serious flaw in our American policy. I think it is not in America's best interest that we do so. I think anything we can do to continue to denuclearize is a good thing, to reduce the number of nuclear weapons and their proliferation is a good thing. This takes us away from that path in doing so. In terms of the bombing of Syria, I think that was largely window dressing. If we really wanted to stand up for our values, then against a force that we know has nuclear weapons, this is the moment for us to have done so. And the president has failed to do it because I think that's not where their real values lie. The sort of pinprick bombs that we dropped on Syria were simply meant to window dress incoherency in our foreign policy that will overlook the abuses of some while extracting disproportionate punishment from others. And so Iran, Syria, North Korea are all examples of what happens when you, because of selfish greed, place a man in the White House who says, "I alone can fix this." He cannot. He is shooting from the hip. He's making this up as he goes along. Everyone knows it. And I'm just wondering, when will the responsible people do what is right and alleviate this threat, this domestic threat to our homeland security that resides at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? I hope I haven't minced words in my actual feelings about that, but I just think that in global policy, especially, the president's actions are much more caustic. He's wrecking, doing a lot of damage in terms of domestic policy, but I think no greater aspect of this can be seen than what we see in foreign policy.
All right, well, that's our last question, and I want to thank you again for agreeing to come here. I know you're busy with the campaign and your profession and all the things you do. I appreciate it, and I hope we can have later discussions after you become the congressman. I hope you don't forget about the little people.
Listen, make no mistake about it. I already have the best job in the world. I am husband to a loving wife. I am father to 2 loving children. I pastor some of the best people in the world in South Georgia, which means I get access to sweet potato pie and some of the best pound cake that you can imagine. I practice law in my own law firm, which means I get to do the kind of law that I want to do, kind of law that I think makes a difference in the life of people. And I'm going to give all that up to run for a job I got to run for every 2 years. That is probably going to pay less than I make now. But I do think that when our children ask us both, and I appreciate all you do as well, and all the service you render, and even, in hosting this podcast, making the truth available to people, that our children will ask us tough questions about what we did with what we had in our hands, the power we have in our hands. And I just want to be able to look my children and their children in the face and say, I did what I could.
That's right.
And so I think that's what we all want to do. So, brother, thank you so much for having me on the show. And we look forward to sharing many times over the future.
All right. Well, with that, I'll say peace and blessings to everybody. And thanks again, Francis, for showing up.
And if you're in the 12th district, if you know somebody in the 12th district, your mama, your cousin, your third cousin, Pookie, Ray, anybody, you let them know that the election is going on right now. Early voting is through next week, through May 18th. You can cast a ballot on the Democratic ballot for Francys Johnson. You can learn more about our campaign at Francys Johnson for Congress. That's francysjohnson.org, FRANCYS Johnson.org. Thank you.
And where are you, what's your Twitter address? You're on Twitter, right?
Yes, I am. Twitter address is at Francys Johnson for Congress. You can Facebook me at Francys Johnson, hashtag People First. And we are here and we are ready to go.
All right.
Thank you.
Peace and blessings, everybody.